I'd like to kick off part 2 with a fireside chat. And we're going to be looking at how we maintain essential services back to CNI. And I'm delighted to welcome Professor Allan Cook from the University of De Montfort. If I can get that right. That's right, De Montfort. He's a visiting professor there. And he's also Director of Cyber Risk at Deloitte. Come on down, Allan. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. So Allan has loads of experience in CNI. I won't say how many years you've been working on it, but loads of great experience. And maybe to just kick things off, for organizations thinking about planning for business continuity and resilience in the face of CNI, what would you say are the top things that they really need to be thinking about?
Sure, it's a really good question. I think when you think about business continuity and disaster recovery, to a certain extent, it's an established process. It's an established discipline. But what do you do when you're trying to incorporate willful acts through the cyber domain in this environment? So if you think about BC and DR, we have a number of scenarios that we think about, and we plan accordingly. The research that we're doing is, if there is a set of scenarios that you've thought about, there must be a set that you haven't thought about. And in that set, there is an adversarial component of people, as I've said, willfully trying to degrade or to damage services. So what does that look like? You can think about the processes and the services that a CNI operator has to maintain. And you can think about the systems that underpin that, and you can start to apply security protections against those. But Paul hit the nail on the head when he opened up this session and started to talk about those supporting services. Charging was the example that he gave. What happens when you lose charging? Can you still supply that service? You know, if you lose heating, cooling, lubrication, will that service still work in the way that you've intended, even in that fallback scenario of a disaster recovery scenario? So we're working on ways and means to think about that and to introduce that adversarial mindset. Then we take it a stage further, and the research is then starting to tease out. Then, once you've thought about that and you've thought about what those circumstances might look like, how would they manifest themselves on your network or on your systems? It's very simple, and a lot of us have done this in the past. There's a bunch of systems there and a process, and you say, well, they'll kind of enter there, and they'll move across there, and they'll reach that point, and they'll do the bad stuff. But when you're looking at that through the worlds of logs and sensors, it's a very different problem. And would you recognize that behavior? Would you even know to look for it? So a lot of the challenges that we're working on at De Montfort and within Deloitte are looking at how these wider scenarios would look on your sensors and logs, and what can you do to be a step ahead so that the first time you experience that is not the first time it
So if you're
happens.
a SOC analyst, and you're presented with all this sort of data, how do you know that it's,
exactly
CNI?
right. Is this normal behavior? Is this the different behavior? Now, for the SOC, you establish your pattern of life and everything that goes with that. Very simple. But when you start to try to incorporate the OT side of things, you can't always put endpoints there. The technology won't support it. If you're working in deterministic systems, you can't introduce the randomness of the latency that it might introduce. So you know that there are components of your network that you can't see in your SOC. So how would you compensate for that? How would you look for the precursor actions or the actions that happened after the event to tell you that has occurred? So we've got a research SOC that De Montfort and Deloitte jointly built exactly for this, where we start to experiment with the behaviors of certain threat actors and how they would look, so you can start to shape how you would look for that.
And you know, in terms of what sort of assets would an analyst have? You know, would you have sort of playbooks, or what sort of things would you be able to use?
Playbooks are an interesting point, and we've been working with the NCSC at De Montfort on this. So playbooks lend themselves to a static problem set. So we talked about the scenarios that you think might happen, and you write a playbook against that. There's evidence that playbooks only get you so far because you have to adapt to the changing environment, the changing state of your networks, the nature of the adversary and what they can do very quickly. So we've started to adopt some techniques from the agile world to allow us to have a set of outcomes, and I'll talk about those subsequently, but you'll have a set of outcomes you're trying to achieve and a set of ways of working to allow you to move towards that end state in the most appropriate way to get there. So if you think about, you know, the use of a backlog and Kanban boards, things that we're using more and more in the engineering world, they allow us to adapt as long as we've got that North Star at the end of this of this service needs to be back at this level of capability.
I did not think we'd be talking about Agile and Kanban in CNI.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere, yeah. I mean, could we go back a little bit and just maybe talk a bit about what are the main causes of CNI that you know, in your experience?
Well, the main challenges that we face, and I think it was James on the panel session who brought it up, is the breadth of the disciplines that you need to bring together. There's the IT side, there's the OT, there's the management, there's the operations, there's the finance, a whole range. And challenges come when you try and bring together people who think differently, or who've got different priorities, or have a priority focused on one particular component of what you're trying to achieve. So what we found through experimentation is that there are 5 mental models that incident response teams need to have in the heads of everybody that's involved. And that allows them to have a common framework to talk to each other, a language, a lexicon, a common set of the priorities you're trying to reach, but what they mean for you, but how you can explain to someone who's not in your area of expertise the consequences of what is going on. Some of these mental models are relatively static and don't change that much. Some change very quickly during an incident. And you don't want to be developing these on the fly. So going back to some of the challenges that we see in CNI, firstly, the first time you run through your response processes shouldn't be the first time that you're having a major cyber incident. Because the best way to learn is through failure. But you don't want to fail when you're going through your first live incident response. So we've been working on techniques to progressively introduce more and more complex and more stressful incident response situations that are geared to building these 5 mental models in the minds of everybody that's going to be involved in a future incident, linking those back to that preemptive understanding of the adversarial picture. So we're not only thinking about what are we seeing on the network, but it allows us to think about what will happen next. If you think about the MITRE attack framework, it's very good, not only at codifying the behaviors, but it gives us a structure that lets us think about the actions that we might see next. Because if all we ever do is respond to what we see, we're only ever catching up. And they may be way past that point. We just haven't seen it. So we talk about this progressive development, progressive rehearsal of the capability. We start off just using very tabletop approaches where we start to just tease out the processes and the language and get people to talk about the information that they need and that other people can potentially supply them. Then start to move that to small-scale technical infrastructures where we start to introduce the IT and the OT. Then introduce digital twins, cyber ranges, these more and more complex environments that allow us to have more complexity to put the team under greater and greater stress up to the point that when this happens for real, they firstly have experienced it, secondly, they've got the mental models and the ways of working to communicate effectively, and thirdly, the stress is something that they're
Brilliant.
confident with.
I wish we had more time to talk about this. No, this is great. This is fascinating. And if people want to know more about your research, they can just Google it on the web.
Absolutely. If people want to speak to me about it, best way is to get me on LinkedIn or something like that, and I can point you at it all.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alan. Please give Alan a round of applause. Thank you so much. Lovely to see you.